Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review the Keanu Reeves Sandra Bullock film, Speed. A lot of people will remember this movie being the bus movie, where, hey, make sure that the bus is over 50 miles an hour. Because we end up having it to where reasonably a lot of people ripped off and stole that concept and tried to implement that in any number of things to where there seems to always be a bomb on something or a bomb on a plane or a bomb on whatever, a bomb. Anyways, so going into this movie, a lot of people would call this the original movie where Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock were together, to where eventually they were reunited on the set of The Lake House, which a lot of people will be like, yeah, that movie was a goofy concept film. I'm like, well, this movie is not much of any different. I wouldn't say that this movie is at all a bad film. I would just say that this movie has a lot of odd line delivery. We end up having it to where there's sometimes where I kind of cringe through some of the line delivery within this film. But also, it seems like they took one thing within this movie that they thought was really cool, and they had to basically use it through this entire movie. What are you gonna do? Somebody has a gun to your head. What are you gonna do? What's your next move, hotshot? We end up having in the very beginning of this film that the character Harry gives out a scenario to Jack Traven's character, and so we end up taking that whole idea of that concept and basically plastering that through this entire film consistently, to where we end up having this thing being a bulk of the script throughout this entire movie, because it honestly feels like they had no real true script. Basically, a bulk of this movie is really resting and relying on the suspense of this film, or the quasi like action packed maneuvers of which that they have to do. A lot of this movie is really heavily relying on the suspense of this film, how we end up having to scare quite a bit of people thinking that, oh my god, there is something going on in the road. Oh no, we have to swerve out of the way. Oh my god, this is the worst possible street that we've ever been in our lives, that we are just going to have to just run over people and change lanes and just, like, we have this police force who cannot clear a road to save their life. On top of that, we end up having consistently, wherever they actually do clear a road, that eventually we end up finding out that it seems that the road of which that they send these people on are undone. We consistently have it to every single time we go into here in different scenarios, but it always has the exact same ending of, well, hey, yeah, like, this is actually undone. This is unfinished. Like, good God, how many of these scenarios do Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock have to go into where, oh, well, this track is not finished, or there's a 50-foot gap that you have to jump, and every single time the same solution is always the same thing, and so on and so forth. But again, people could just take this movie and enjoy how fun it is. Some people might have a variety of different kinds of thoughts about this movie. Some people might enjoy the suspense or the adrenaline rush that they get from being hopeful that Keanu Reeves and Keanu Reeves is people that he's working with throughout this movie are going to rescue all these people and save the day. And so we also have it to where we have a goofy villain in this movie who is named Howard Payne. Of course, the villain in this film has to be called some condescendingly Like, oh yeah, he's bringing the pain. Weird. So we end up having Howard Payne, who ends up luckily having a pretty decent backstory, but also a lot about this guy isn't exactly clear. Of like, there's a lot of like kind of things that we kind of have to like put together in our own head. We end up having also uh, us having this guy who's like, okay, why did he go into like bombs? Like, why did he exactly do this whole bomb thing? Like, and we have this guy who is consistently putting all of these bombs together and demanding all this big, huge sum of money to eventually not get that sum of money. So I'm like, dude, how expensive is all of this stuff costing this guy? Like, dude, by the time that he does all of this, like, bomb making and all kinds of things, he probably would have spent every little cent of whatever ransom that he was going to hold Keanu Reeves and Harry over. We end up having within this film that like it's just a really fun movie, and that's all you could probably really say about it. Again, some people might have slightly different feelings about this movie. Eventually, a lot of people might go back into this film. I guess currently that this film could probably be seen in any number of places, but I would also probably suggest, if people do not know about this yet, you can probably go into a movie app, or like a Movie Pro, or a Ultra or a Play Ultra movie app of sorts, and you can actually watch this movie for free. Uh, Here is also the funny kind of thing. Some people may not have remembered or known that Speed actually had a sequel movie to it, and Sandra Bullock actually returned for the sequel film. Uh, we ended up having seemingly the vampire guy who was the main character from The Lost Boys was actually in that sequel as Keanu Reeves's character, and I believe Willem Dafoe, I think, was the villain of that movie. But the entire Speed 2 film was done via off of a cruise ship or a boat of sorts. So I'm like, wow. So in other words, Speed basically covered every single other thing that they could do, to where they decided, like, well, what could we do for the sequel? Well, there's only one thing left. Boat, right? Because the first one did such a bang up job of putting so much stuff into the first film that like, it's not just a bus movie, it's an elevator film, it's a train film or a subway film, it's any number of other things, a bomb film. God, what else freaking happens in this film? We end up having a Keanu Reeves chasing this bus and jumping onto it, and so on and so forth. That kind of film, action packed, uh, adrenaline rush film, whichever. Anyways, so reasonably, it's kind of funny because I don't really like cop films. Like, I try to avoid uh, doing anything that has kind of like cop, bomb squad, whichever kind of films. Like, they just kind of tire me out. Really, a lot of them are just kind of the same old song and dance. But I actually like this one just because it's kind of a thrill ride throughout this entire movie. So I'm not saying that this is probably like, this is horrible, this is a horrible movie, no one should watch it. No. I would say that besides the line delivery of things, the goofy way of just kind of like having Keanu like comfort the passengers in bizarrish like moments, or we end up having to have some backstory of these passengers as if like we're supposed to invest in them. we end up having it to where I think that this movie overall is just a fun movie because the actors within it sell you the film. And like, if the actors were not good enough for this movie and they just relied on the story, the concept, the whatever, I honestly think that this movie, we would not be talking about it today. We would not be talking about this film. And I think they picked the right people in Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves doing this film. So, with that said, I think it's about time to go into spoilers about this film. I would say that this film is like, it does kind of feel dated to me because it kind of feels like it doesn't feel like this movie is timeless. There's some kind of goofy things about this film, and it's just very at some points. It's just kind of cringe at some point. Some of the line delivery, but people go into this film and just love the heck out of it, and good for you. Some people might just like this movie a different way than I do, and some people might be like, "No, Speed is my favorite film of all time. How could you say that Speed has anything bad with it? Because it's really, really great." That's just how I feel about it. It's just kind of a dated film. So let's go out of our way to date this film by going into spoilers about it. So it's about that time to say that this movie is not a bus film. Well, yeah, but reasonably, the bus is in like 70% of this movie, and then 30% of it is whatever the heck we have to try to invest in Keanu Reeves and Harry's character. But then eventually we also have to invest in Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves' character that are mostly, guess what, in the bus. So, guess what happens? Bus wins. Bus wins. Fatality. Mortal fatality. Anyways, so let's get into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, the very beginning of this is not a bus scene. We end up having, supposedly, some business people who are going into an elevator. And so we end up having Howard Payne, who is to go into a elevator, adjacent of these people, a freight elevator, let's just say. We end up having Howard Payne, who ends up killing seemingly a guy who is watching over this freight elevator. And so we have Howard Payne going into this freight elevator, and we end up having some people who are going into this other elevator or that has a bomb that seems to be established onto this elevator. And so we end up having to where these people are thinking that their day is just a normal, common day, but then we end up finding out that Howard Payne is being able to control this elevator. And so we end up having it to where the police are otherwise called. It seems like the task force of Keanu Reeves, who is Jack Traver, Captain McMahon, and Harry are on the case to go out of their way to figure out what is going on with this elevator. And so we end up finding out that seemingly that we end up having this elevator not going anywhere. And so we end up finding out that so this police force is called, who I guess are just these bizarre like people that can do any number of things. I don't know what exactly this task force is, but they're just there. So we end up having this task force who ends up going and seemingly going and opening a elevator door from a floor above, and so they end up going and sliding down onto this elevator to go and check and see how exactly that this elevator is wired. So we end up having Howard Payne, who is in the freight elevator adjacent of these people. And so we end up having Howard Payne, who ends up hearing uh, people trying to get to this elevator. And so we end up having it to where we have Jack Traver, who is to go and attach uh, some uh, line to go and tie this elevator to some crane thing on top of this building. Unfortunately, this crane like thing that is on top of this building, this little device that has this line, doesn't really seem to be all of that strong. And so, reasonably, when we have Howard Payne, who ends up blowing the elevator brakes on this elevator, we start to have this elevator start to fall pretty quickly. We end up having both Jack and Harry scrambling to find the floor of the elevator door that is where they are at. They end up opening it and they end up trying to grab as many people as humanly possible, as quickly as humanly possible. To where, like, at first the elevator is up too high, then eventually it slowly but surely uh, starts to slowly fall down because the uh, line that is kind of hooking onto this thing is just kind of dragging itself to eventually have this elevator completely fall. So we end up having Keanu, who is trying to get everybody out of this elevator, grabbing everybody's arms and all kinds of things. We have one woman who is just hesitantly just like, no, I can't move. And Keanu's like, come on, lady, you're going to die. And so we end up having Keanu grabbing this one scared woman and retrieving her just in the nick of time because this elevator falls within the last person and what have you. We also bizarrely have this elevator who seems in one corner of the elevator has bizarrely a hole within it because I guess of this explosion of these brakes going out. And so we end up having one person ending up almost falling through this elevator, and we end up having a bunch of people having to grab her and retrieve her from falling out of this elevator. So we end up having Jack and Harry going like, well, hey, mission well done, and yeah, we did it. And so they end up going, you know what, how is it exactly that this Howard Payne guy could figure out what was going on with this elevator? It seems that he blew the brakes at the perfect time. Like, he must have heard something. He must have known something. And so they end up trying to say, like, well, like, we, like, evacuated the entire building. If anything, like, we checked all the other elevators. And so, like, there was nobody that seemed to be there. And then Keanu was like, well, we didn't check the freight elevator now, did we? And they're like, oh. So we end up having Keanu and Harry backtrack to make it to the freight elevator. And so we end up having Howard Payne, who ends up going in and shooting the top of this elevator with a shotgun, to where eventually we end up having it to where, since this elevator is on top of it is getting shot up so much, eventually we end up having Harry, who ends up falling through, and then eventually we end up having Howard, who ends up pressing the up button for this elevator to go as far up as it can. And so Jack ends up jumping into the elevator to avoid getting crushed. And so we end up having Howard Payne, who ends up grabbing Harry, and now we end up having this scenario that is to be played out, because we end up having Harry giving Jack a scenario of like, well, hey man, like this bad guy is to have a hostage, and like, he's threatening to kill her, and what do you do? and we end up having Jack mention it's like, well, I'd shoot the hostage, and then so that way the bad guy doesn't want to just carry on the hostage. He gives up on the hostage, and then you end up catching your guy afterwards. So we end up having Howard Payne, who evidently has strapped himself with a bunch of bombs upon himself. And so we end up having Howard with the itchy trigger finger, and now we end up having Harry, who is being held up by Howard Payne. And so we end up having Harry telling Jack, it's like, hey man, like, shoot the hostage. Like, scenario, shoot the hostage. And so we end up having it to where Jack ends up going and shooting Harry in the leg to where Harry ends up falling off to the side. And so Howard ends up running off, and Jack ends up chasing behind him. And so we end up having the area of which that Howard was in explode, and they are to naturally assume that Howard is dead. So we seemingly have Jack and Harry getting some award for a job well done because they went out of their way to ending up finding this villain and also saving all these people in this elevator. So we end up having both of them getting an award, and Harry the entire time is giving crap to Jack because it's like, dude, you shot me. And Jack is like, dude, you told me to. And Jack is like, well, and Harry is like, well, yeah, but you still shot me. Like, how could you? Like, anywhere else, and more than likely, they would have been giving this award to my wife. And so we end up having it to where all of these people end up all going out to this bar. They end up celebrating their success of this mission. And so we end up having Harry, who is now going to have to forcibly be stuck upon a desk. And so we end up having Harry telling Jack, well, hey man, like, you got to make sure that you're going to be as good as you possibly can, because I won't be there to be watching your back anymore, and so on and so forth. We end up having Harry, who is basically telling Jack, it's like, dude, you need to be the best that you can be right now, because I won't be there alongside you. And so Jack's like, uh-huh. So we end up having Harry, who ends up getting way too drunk, and he decides, dude, I'm going to go home and sleep with my wife. And so Jack is like, dude, you're going to go home and barf. And Harry's like, well, yeah, and that'll be fun too. So we end up having it to where they end up going out of their way to leave their respective bar. And so we end up having Jack, who is to go and seemingly get some some coffee or something of sorts. And so he ends up bumping into this bus driver that I guess he's very familiar with. And so we end up having Jack and this bus driver kind of having their moments. And so we end up having this bus driver to drive off to eventually explode right in front of Jack. And so we end up having Jack trying to run to the bus to see if he can save anybody from off of this bus, but it's impossible. And so we end up having, bizarrely, Jack getting a phone call that is, of course, from Howard Payne to remind him, hey, I'm still alive there, buddy. And so we end up having it to where Howard is, of course, going to play off this scenario of like, hey, what are you going to do? There's a bus that is strapped with a bomb upon itself. It has to go 50 miles an hour or it's going to explode. You can't evacuate any of the people on the bus or it's going to explode. What are you going to do? And we end up having Keanu going like, well, I'd like to know where the bus is and what bus it is. And so we end up having Howard Payne going like, oh, well, that's a great question. Well, we end up having Howard Payne telling exactly where the bus is and when the bus is and why the bus is. So we now end up having Jack, who is now racing against time to try and find this bus. So we end up having Jack chasing after this bus in some kind of Jaguar of sorts. Or, no, wait. It's not a Jaguar. It's a. Yeah, it's a Jaguar. Luckily, I was good on the guess of that because I wasn't even sure. So, we end up having seemingly. Because we end up having Jack chasing after this bus and it ends up driving off. And so we end up having Jack going into this Jaguar of this person and chasing this bus down. And so we end up having Jack, who is trying to tell this bus driver, there's a bomb on your bus. And so we end up having this bus driver's like, dude, this guy's crazy. And so we end up having Sandra Bullock going upon this bus to be annoyed by some tourist who has to tell his entire life story of how he's been a tourist and how he has just come from the airport and every little bit of touristy thing that he has to do. And he's the most touristy tourist that he's ever tourist, and so on and so forth, to get us to bizarrely be annoyed by this guy, but we will remember his backstory for reasons that I don't quite understand. It seems that we have to eventually start to invest in some of these people in this bus. Eventually, once we start to roll really Keanu into this bus, when that actually happens. So we end up having it to where Jack is to take the Jaguarish like phone, and so we end up having Jack having the Jaguar owner go and call this number. And so we end up having Jack talking to Harry about the reason why he's late for work is because there's a bomb on a bus. And so we end up having Jack luckily being able to keep this Jaguar phone. And so we end up having it to where Jack is to go and basically have the Jaguar door ripped off the side of this car so that way Jack can jump from Jaguar car to bus because they can't stop the bus, and so Jack now has to jump onto the bus because he ended up tossing a paper note to hit the windshield of this bus to say bomb on bus. And so the driver is like, oh my God, there's a bomb on this bus? And so we end up having Keanu explaining everything to this bus driver, and he's going like, oh, okay, this is great. Bomb on my bus. This is exciting. No, he's miserable. So we have Jack jumping onto this bus, and so now we are to end up having Jack explain to this bus driver all the rules, and so now he has to forcibly explain all of this to all of these bus riders, because we end up having it to where there seems to be one guy that seems to be, I guess, an illegal, I guess, or something along those lines. And so he ends up pulling a gun on Jack. And so Jack is like, dude, put your gun away. If anything, like, I do not care what crime you have committed. I do not care what illegal thing that you have done. I don't care. All that matters to me is that I let you know that this bomb is going to explode. We had to stay over 50 or the bomb will explode. There's a bomb on this bus and I have to explain everything. So we end up having it to where this guy with a gun is to reasonably just not be at all pleased about what is going on. So he wants them to stop the bus, and they're just like, no, we are just not going to do that. So we eventually end up having it to where it forcibly goes into them having to fight over this gun. We end up having seemingly both Jack and a guy named Ortiz wrestling over this gun. And so we end up having it to where eventually that they get the gun away from this guy, but accidentally this guy ends up shooting the bus driver. And so this guy is starting to bleed out. We end up having Sandra Bullock, who is to transition from passenger to now bus driver. And it seems that we end up finding out that her license had been revoked for speeding, of all things. Because she even was like, dude, speed, I have to speed. Everybody needs to speed. I did the movie called Speed. Look at me. Wee-hee. I even did the sequel movie. Look at me now. Look at me now. I just love speed. So we end up having it to where Sandra Bullock is now the driver of this thing. And so we end up having Keanu Reeves asking her if she's all right, like if everything is cool, if she is able to be a person to be able to drive this bus. And we end up having, of course, Annie say, yeah, I can drive this bus. We consistently have Keanu Reeves calling Annie ma'am, to where eventually we end up having Annie eventually correcting Keanu Reeves to just like, dude, just call me Annie. It's like, I'm a little sick of the ma'am thing. So we end up having it to where eventually, towards the very tail end of this movie, we end up having Keanu Reeves calling Annie ma'am again, to where eventually I was just waiting for like Sandra Bullock to just like just jab him with a thing of glass or something, because like, stop calling me ma'am. So we end up having it to where so here's the thing. So we end up having now that that Jack is calling any of all of his people, and so they're all scrambling to try and find a road for Jack to be on. And so we end up having Captain McMahon from the sky, from a helicopter, trying to help Keanu clear some things out, but this is taking forever. And so we end up having Annie, who is consistently driving through what is to be a baby stroller, and she's like, oh my god, I killed a baby, but instead it was just a whole entire thing of pop cans. And to where Keanu has to turn to her and like, no, it was just cans. It wasn't a baby, it was just cans. And like Sandra Bullock was like, oh my god, I killed a child. But no, it wasn't a child. So we push on. So we end up having Sandra Bullock just all through these roads having to transfer from one thing of street to another because there was no way around any of this. So we end up having we end up having Annie going into traffic. She's driving and the cars are coming this way. And like, she's like, everybody get out of my way. Everyone get out of my way. It's like as if like everyone was prepared for a bus to come onto the wrong side of the road and all kinds of jazz. So we end up eventually having it to where Captain McMahon is to set up this road for them to go on to, which is a road that they are to close off. And we end up finding out that they have to take this bizarrish turn that is almost going to tip this bus over. And so we end up having Keanu saying, everybody on this side of the bus. And so everyone has to get onto one side of the bus and I guess also try to eat as much food as they possibly can to make sure that they're just a little bit heavier for this side of the bus, and so on and so forth. We end up having them like, dude, get all kinds of food in here so we can eat, so we can just be a little bit heavier for this side of the bus. Just everybody, just bring in a pizza or something. So we end up having, of course, Annie is to take this really hard turn. They end up on kind of like tipsying, but everybody is just heavy enough to where they are to not completely 100% tip over this bus. So we end up having it uh, to where they have to try and figure out what this bomb is to look like. And so we end up having the bus driver telling Keanu that there is a latch for him to unhook. I'm like, man, this bus has all kinds of like hatches to unhook to see underneath this bus. It's crazy. How we end up having Keanu Reeves popping his head down to give this phone to a guy named Stevens, to where Keanu is to repeat back, or Stevens is to repeat back everything that Jack is saying and Harry is saying to each one another. And so we end up having Jack popping his head down to see what this bomb is like. And we end up having it to where this bomb is really very complicated, to the point to where there's even a decoy bomb, to where eventually when Jack does find the correct bomb, the bomb is really heavily difficult, and it's going to be really, really hard for them to just figure out how to defuse this bomb. So we end up going on, and so we end up having eventually to where Howard Payne is to eventually get a hold of Jack. And so we end up having it to where Jack is to go and mention to Howard that it's like, hey man, like I have a wounded bus driver here, like could we let him off this bus? And Howard Payne is like, no, like didn't I tell you to not let anybody off of this bus? And it's like, well, Jack is like, well, yeah, but he's shot. And like Howard's like, dude, what are you doing, just shooting all your bus drivers? And like, what the heck is going on, Jack, over there? And so we end up having it to where Howard is consistently called is to consistently call Annie a wildcat, and to say that, yeah, that wildcat better keep a good eye on the wheel, and so on and so forth. And Jack doesn't really think anything of it, but eventually he comes up with a consensus of how it seems that Howard can see what is going on, because he always has to be near the action, so to speak. And so we end up having it to where Howard is to let the one bus driver go. And so we end up having it to where Captain McMahon is driving alongside this bus, and to say like, dude, we need to like start evacuating these people. And Jack is like, no, like that's not going to happen because the bus will explode. And so the bus will explode. So we end up having them giving away the bus driver. And so we end up having Jack asking the bus driver, like, well, hey, the bus driver, Sam, hey, how are you feeling there, buddy? And so we end up having the bus driver saying, like I've been shot. It's like, what do you think? It's like, we end up having Keanu with all of these, like, bizarrish, awkward lines that he has to deliver to some of these passengers that just seem so weird and so awkward. Like, we end up having, at some point, Stevens, the tourist guy, who is to mention, like, dude, I can't be here. Like, I can't be here right now. Like I'm too young to die, and all this kinds of stuff. And we end up having Ortiz, that Jack ends up calling like him Gigantor or something. We end up having Ortiz saying like, dude, I got a wife. And we have another passenger who's like, oh, so your life is more significant because you have a wife? Good for you. And so on and so forth. And we have some of the passengers fighting it out to eventually Jack has to like silence everybody. He's like, dude, like, this sucks that you guys are all in this situation, but it is what it is. So shut up and just kind of just whatever I ask you to do, do. So we push on. So we end up having again the guy who ended up shooting the bus driver. He ended up getting cuffed and he apologized for what he did, but still shot somebody. So, anyways, we go on and we have them hand off the bus driver, but we end up having one woman who is really terrified, named Helen. It seems that both Annie and Helen were having this exchange of stuff of sorts and whatever and what have you, and we end up having a tour. I think Helen loved to be on the bus. Like, if anything, it was too stressful for her to be able to drive wherever she was to go. And we end up having it to where Annie says, like, no, like, I had lost my car, and my car is the one thing that I really love. That's the thing I really miss, is to, I guess, avoid all of these people on this bus to just have her own alone time with her car. So we end up having Helen, who is terrified by this whole situation. And so we end up having Helen, who ends up starting to reach out to these police officers, and they almost end up grabbing her. Well, Howard Payne ends up seeing this, and he ends up going on into taking out the entire stairs of this bus. And so Helen ends up getting sucked under this bus and run over by this bus. And so we end up having, of course, Annie freaking out because of all this situation happening and freaking out about the death of the person that she had just saw, dot, 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 dot. So we end up of course having Jack mention that they desperately need to get those news choppers out of here, because Jack is assuming that that since these news choppers are there, that that's the reason why Howard can be able to see everything. And we end up having Howard, who is eventually going and watching this on the news and watch it unfold. And so we are ending up assuming that's how Howard can be able to see everything that's going on, which isn't exactly true. So we end up going along and having a gap in this road. And so we end up having them decide that there is a 50 feet gap or whatever in this road. And so we end up having Keanu deciding that they need to floor it. Because he's assuming that they should just be able to jump this gap. Hopefully it's not as big as they were to think it is, and so maybe they can just jump this gap. And so we end up having it to where they end up flooring it, and so they end up jumping the gap. They end up, of course, making the gap, and so we end up having eventually that it seems that there is more and more difficult road to come ahead. And so we end up having Keanu Reeves decide to drive into this airport that is to have endless runways for them to just continue to just kind of like circle around back and forth to get through. And we end up having Captain McMahon and Norwood just telling how great of an idea that was. And so you would have thought that they would have came up with that like right freaking away, but I guess they didn't think about it. So hence why, like, I'm sorry, like, these superiors of Jack are just really not that smart. They're just really not like really putting their best foot forward in this situation. Plus, there was also a moment to where almost Andy end up running over some pedestrians at some point in this movie, but luckily she missed out on all of them, and so on and so forth. That was another scary moment. So they end up continuing to do the runway of this airport, and so we end up having it to where eventually uh, we end up finding out that Harry is trying to figure out on his own where is this guy, where is this bombardier-ish like person. And so they were looking for mugshots before, but Howard says like there's got to be something with that gold watch that is on that bomb. And so we end up having Harry going like, dude, we need to look through we need to look through like police records and police people, and we need to find this guy. And so we end up having Harry eventually going through and finding all police people till eventually they end up finding Howard Payne. And so we end up having Harry deciding to go off and go with these guys to go and try to get Howard at his home. And so while that is to also go on, we also have Jack, who is to go underneath this bus to try and defuse this bomb. So we end up having Jack, who is, while this bus is in motion and while this other vehicle is in motion, we end up having Jack going in and going underneath this bus via some bizarrish little wheelie device that is to have him go underneath this bus. So we bizarrely have this airport like road having like the worst like traction or bizarrish like things that just keep having this bus like getting jockeyed around. And we end up having also that these pieces accidentally end up clogging up Keanu's little wheelie device of which that he is on, to where eventually while Keanu is trying to figure out how to defuse this bomb and cannot because it's so complicated, that whatever Keanu is going to do, it's going to fire, it's going to explode. And so while Jack is calling Harry before Harry goes off to find Howard Payne, we end up having the thing that Keanu is on to try to figure out about this bomb. We end up having this thing going and being detached from where like the string of which that was holding said vehicle from where Jack was, blah blah blah. So we end up having this thing detach, and so now Jack has to jump onto some part of the bottom of this bus to try and stay on this bus and not get run over by this bus. And so we end up having these people notice that that Jack had gotten his thing run over, and they had gotten to the point of being scared of like, oh my god, did we run him over? And so now people are trying to look as much as possible underneath the bus. We have Ortiz, who is ending up trying to open up some hatch in the bus to try and see if he can find where Jack is. And so we end up having Jack, who ended up having to shove a screwdriver into the gas tank of this bus. And so they are now starting to drain gas. And so we end up having it to where Keanu is just holding on for dear life on this bus. We end up seeing his like feet just kind of dangling right next to the tire of this bus, and so we end up having Ortiz who ends up popping his head down to be like, "Oh, hello, Keanu Reeves," and so we end up having Ortiz screaming to Annie that he sees him, and so we end up having Ortiz having to grab Keanu and kind of like muscle him up into being back into this bus, and we end up having Captain McMahon from off to the side to be like, dude, how many lives do you have, buddy? It's like yeah, you almost died there. And so we end up having Ortiz kind of joking about that Jack has a giant size of cojones and so on and so forth. Ba 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 ba. So we end up having it to where Harry is to make his way to Howard Payne's place, and we end up finding out that this place was a trap. To where Harry ends up going into the house, and the whole entire house ends up exploding, and so we end up having it to where Jack is to assume that Harry is to call to say, hey, I got the guy, like everything's great, thumbs up. But instead, we end up having Howard calling Jack to mention that, hey, yeah, just a little heads up, your partner is dead. And guess what? Like, they didn't catch me, ha 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 ha. And so we end up having Jack learning that his partner is dead via Howard, and we end up having Jack, who is just really upset at this point, to the point where he's just like, God, he's just like flinging around and all like upset, to where everybody's like, what the heck is going on with that guy? To where Annie's like, dude, you can't you can't lose it now. Like, come on, like we're almost home. We're almost there. And so we end up having Jack saying like, dude, we're all gonna die. Like we end up having Jack who is just losing all hope, and Annie is like, no, like I think we're fine. The only problem is I think we're starting to lose gas. And so we end up having it to where eventually we end up having it to where Jack ends up realizing that it seems that Annie has some sweatshirt or something that is to uh, be of some team, the Arizona Wildcats. And so we end up. So then we realize that Jack notices that Howard Payne could have seen what is going on this entire time through uh, through somehow being able to see what's going on in this bus. And so we end up having it to where something as simple as Wildcat triggers uh, Jack to realize that, oh my god, Howard can see. So we end up having uh, Jack telling Jack telling uh, Annie to just kind of just keep looking on, and Jack is going to try to figure something out. So we end up eventually having Jack going through and just kind of looking through some of the mirrors of this bus, and we end up having it to where Jack notices that there is a mirror with a camera off to the side, and so Jack is like, oh my god, like Howard has been seeing us this entire time through this through this camera. He can't actually hear us, but he can like see us. So we end up having it to where Jack is relaying this to Annie, and so we end up having it to where Jack is to tell eventually his Captain McMahon about what is going on, and so we end up having it to where Captain McMahon is to go to these news reporters and go and try to figure out and track down this feed. And so we have these news reporters that can just bizarrely be able to find this feed. And so we end up having it to where their grandmaster plan is to record a videotape of what is going on in this bus and try to loop it as much as possible. And so we end up having it to where Keanu is to tell everybody, okay, just look straight on, and like they'll just tape this for us, and then we can evacuate out of here. So they end up looping the tape, and so like they're really close at losing gas, and so now we have to scramble to have every single person get off of this bus one by one, and they end up doing it via like transferring these people from one bus to the other. And so we end up having it to where now Keanu is to go and try and put a thing that is going to have this bus continue to keep on going on. And to where both Annie and him now have to take the middle section that could come off to get them to be able to slide right out from underneath this bus to be able to escape the explosion of this bus, because this bus rams into some plane and big explosion, and Keanu Reeves and Annie slid from underneath this bus to conveniently be able to avoid this whole explosion and everything. So we end up thinking that, yay, we've won, we've beat it, hey, this is great. And so we end up having both Jack and Annie going on to this ambulance, and we end up having it to where Captain McMahon is thinking about giving Jack the rest of the day off, and like for a hard day's work, and so on and so forth. And so we end up having it to where we eventually find that Howard Payne is to eventually still be asking for his ransom. And so we end up having it to where they are to figure out exactly where to put this ransom. And Howard Payne orchestrates it where this drop off is right around where his place is. And so we end up having Howard Payne telling them to dump it off at some garbage somewhere, and of course they do so. So we end up having it to where Keanu is telling them, yeah, give him the ransom, because he doesn't know that the bus is exploded and whatever, that he still thinks that he's getting away with this and that he's going to get his ransom. So we end up having it to where they, I think at some point they were going to try and get a gas tanker to go off to the side of this bus, but that never actually happened. They just came up with some kind of interesting scheme to be able to avoid all of that. So anyways, we end up having Howard, who is to watch on this footage, and then eventually he ends up seeing some woman drop her purse, to eventually realize she ends up having her purse reappear in her hands. And we end up having Howard being furious about this whole thing being played out. To eventually we end up having Howard, who ends up having the plan of going into police uniform and seemingly being able to bump into Annie and say that, oh, hey, like, I'm working alongside with Jack, and I want to be able to get you to a much safer location. To where really Howard is going to strap a bomb upon Annie and eventually have her come with him to go and retrieve this money. And so we end up having it to where they end up dumping the money into this trash can. And so we end up having it to where they're like, why isn't anybody coming for this money? Why is this person taking a fairly long time. This doesn't make any sense. And so we end up having it to where Jack immediately like mentions it's like, well, how about we put how about we turn on the tracker that is on the uh that is on the bag. And so we end up finding out that the bag is bizarrely moving underground. And so we end up having Keanu who ends up ripping off uh, the trash can thing to find out that there was a hole underneath the ground. And so we end up having Keanu jumping underground to track down where Howard is. And so we end up finding out that it seems that Annie has a bomb strapped to her. And so now we have the what do you do? Because we end up having Jack who is tracking down this bomb guy, and we end up finding out that Annie has a bomb on her. So this plays out all over again with the whole Harry scenario, but now it's Annie. So we end up having Jack chasing Howard all the way to this subway. And so we end up having it to where Jack is to consistently follow Howard all the way to the subway to the point where eventually he ends up trying to open this door right before he ends up getting clipped. And so we end up having Jack getting close to Howard, and eventually we end up having Howard who ends up going and killing off this subway driver, so that way he can have complete control of the plane or complete control of the subway. We end up having Howard just shooting all over the subway driver to make sure that it seems that all of the devices and everything that could break this subway, like emergency brakes or all kinds of things, do not work. The radio does not work. Nothing works. So we end up having it to where Howard is to just go like, well, hey man, like I'm just gonna relish in like me getting out of here, and I can't wait to just spend all this money. And so we end up having Jack making his way to Howard, and so Howard ends up starting to shoot up the very top of the subway because he hears Jack kind of climbing his way through the top of the subway. And so we have it to where Howard ends up going and checking on his money to find out that there is a ink bomb when Jack opens it to where it ruins all of the money. And so we end up having Howard, who cannot spend this money now, being absolutely frustrated to the point of him chasing after Jack on the top of this subway to where they are having this fight out to where eventually we end up having it to where Jack ends up pushing Howard to get hit with this like stop light thing to where Howard ends up losing his head. So we ended up having Annie cuffed to this subway, and so we end up having it to where Jack ends up checking out on Annie. He ends up easily just taking this bomb vest thing off of her, and so he ends up going on to try and stop this bus, and of course, or this subway, and of course he can't, and so we end up having it to where, of course, Captain McMahon is bizarrely on the radio of this coincidental train that I guess he ends up figuring out Jack is on, basically telling him, "Hey, like the line of which that you are going on, yeah, it's like it's not finished." And so we end up having Jack going like, "Oh crap, well, we need to jump off." And so we end up having Jack trying to kick and all kinds of things, trying to rip off this railing that Annie is cuffed on, but he can't. So he otherwise decides, well, there's only one thing to do, and that's to basically just speed up this subway to hope that the speed of this subway can just kind of be able to do whatever they can to just be able to get out of here safely. And we eventually have it to where this subway ends up going on and on and on, to eventually ends up derailing, and to where eventually it ends up just like starting to uh, roll and all kinds of things, to eventually to where this subway ends up crashing through this sign, whatever, what have you, to where eventually we end up having both Sandra Bullock and Keanu kind of in the middle of the street somewhere, to where we end up having Annie saying like, "Dude, you didn't leave me," and like Keanu was like, "Well, I had nowhere better to go." We end up having Keanu throw the line to Annie about people being involved in these kind of situations. The relationship never lasts, and we end up having it to where Annie's like, "Well, we're gonna just have to base our relationship on sex then." And so we end up having both Annie and Jack kissing it out. And so we end up having it to where they end up kind of going off on that. Bizarrely, there is some glass of sorts that ended up like falling upon them while they're kissing, which I thought was weird. But we end up having everybody checking on both Keanu and Annie, and they're like, ah, they're fine. Ah, they lived. And so recently, that's just the way that this movie just ends. And so, with that said, I am going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.